one of the groups that I follow, I saw that they posted a sticker that said remigration now, but had this very, very cute aesthetic on it, like blonde girls with pigtails wearing pink kind of thing. And I thought, okay, this is a bit of a cursed combination. Let's look into it more. And then I very quickly saw that PayPal was the first logo that appeared.
Follow the money.
PayPal has clear rules. It says it does not allow organizations that promote hate, discrimination, or racism on its platform. But when journalist Polina Baklakova started looking into merchandise sold by far-right groups in Europe, she kept running into the same thing: PayPal. The payments giant appears to be failing to enforce its own rules. And PayPal doesn't seem to be the only big tech company that turns a blind eye to facilitating extremist content. I'm your host, Emma, and this is the podcast of the investigative newsroom, Follow the Money. Good morning, Polina. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So your story starts with some slogans on products, to be specific, mugs, t-shirts such as anti-woke feminist, foreign rapist out, make feminism great again. Maybe at first glance, not your average start to a story. How did you come across these products and how did they lead you to a story?
I came across these products because for a while I've been keeping my eye on the young far right in Europe on social media. I've been keeping an eye on how they're communicating, what kind of things they're posting. And I think at some point, one of the groups that I follow, I saw that they posted a sticker that said remigration now, but had this very, very cute aesthetic on it, like blonde girls with pigtails wearing pink kind of thing. And I thought, okay, this is a bit of a cursed combination. Let's look into it more. Very quickly, I Googled this product and I found the web shop where they sell it. And then when I, just to be curious, tried to buy it just to see how easy that was, I very quickly saw that PayPal was the first logo that appeared. This seems surprising to me because in my head, I assumed that a very large payment platform would have probably quite strict rules around content, which to me seemed far right adjacent. So then I quickly looked into their acceptable use policy and I saw that, in fact, PayPal prohibits transactions that relate to racism, xenophobia, hate, discrimination, and so on and so forth. Then I got curious and started poking around the other far right groups. And I very quickly realized that although all of these groups use a variety of payment platforms, some are mainstream, some are crypto, for instance, PayPal's name appeared most of all. So then I got my story and I wanted to find out, why is it that PayPal is the far right's favorite payment platform?
Before we dive into the answer that you found to that question, you just mentioned far right groups. In your story, you even focus on a very specific kind of far right groups, groups that call themselves feminist. What can you tell us about the kind of groups that they are?
So our story focused on femonationalists. Femonationalism is a term that was coined by the researcher Sarah Ferris over 10 years ago now. Originally, in her definition, it referred to groups which co-opt feminism or feminist adjacent ideals to really promote Islamophobic, racist, and xenophobic viewpoints. The groups that I focused on in this story, they largely fit into this scheme. And I think a caveat is that they are focusing on statistically what is a smaller problem compared to violence that affects women. If we look at the data for violence against women in Europe, it's typically the household and intimate partners that lead to the most violence against women. It is not migrant men who come to Europe. So the focus on the threat that migrant men pose, it is disproportionate. So that's why I think it's not actually very much about protecting women. They use feminism just to push forward a far-right and discriminatory agenda.
And an example of those groups is the French collective Nemesis, which is the one that you focus on in your article. And what sort of activities have they carried out over the past years?
Collective Nemesis have done a lot of actions. They have staged anti-migrant protests. They've also staged stunts such as wearing hijabs and niqabs to make the point that women from Muslim cultures are oppressed by evil men. So it's not about, the culture being patriarchal. It's about the men being inherently evil and therefore do not belong in Europe. Their social media strategy is almost entirely focused on saying, look, here's this migrant man who raped this young girl, how terrible it is. And then they just repeat this over and over and over again. So Nemesis try to build this universe on the streets, but also online that makes it seem as if really migrant men are the one source of violence against women. And they do this quite effectively, at least on social media, because they're very, very active. As in, they position themselves as an innocent kind of for women's sake grassroots group, but there are documented ties between Nemesis and neo Nazis. There has been a photo leaked of Nemesis's founder making a symbol that is associated with Hitler's SS. She denied that that's a symbol, but she said it was for a rap group. It's very dubious which group it is. She didn't name it. And there have been calls in France to dissolve Nemesis. So there's a dark underbelly to Nemesis, which is somewhat hidden online. But if you dig around a little bit into reporting that's been done around them, it's not that hidden.
And then they sell this almost like cute looking merchandise. Can you take us inside their web shop? Like, what sort of articles do we find there?
Right. So, of course. So, Nemesis, before my investigation came out, they sold clothes and socks and mugs and posters. After the investigation, they have taken down some offending items, which is interesting. but so they had a mug which in French spells foreign rapists out. They also had a poster which says Father Christmas remigrate all those rapists. And then they have things which are a bit softer in the tone and also not overtly discriminatory or racist, like a hat that says "Make Feminism Great Again" and a T-shirt that says "Anti-woke feminist." So they have a range of items which ultimately, a work to promote them, but also put a sugary saccharine twist on what is ultimately messaging that points to ethnic cleansing and racism.
So we can buy this stuff through PayPal, but why did that stand out to you?
So in PayPal's acceptable use policy, it is prohibited to use PayPal for transactions that promote hate, violence, racism, xenophobia, discrimination, and intolerance. What I found very interesting about this is two things. Number one, when I looked at other comparable payment platforms, most do not have a line like this in their acceptable use policy. This is of PayPal's own volition that they put in this kind of rule that said these kind of transactions have no place on our platform. Number two, I really focused on the language because, racism and xenophobia, okay, the definitions are quite clear cut. But words like intolerance and discrimination, to me, those are very subjective words, which actually cast a very wide net. So I thought, okay, why is PayPal giving itself this much responsibility to catch discrimination? I mean, then that would ultimately mean that they have to catch a lot of discrimination. And if that is not happening, why is that not happening?
Yeah, and what is the reason that PayPal doesn't really seem to be enforcing its own policy?
The issue is that when it comes to the far right specifically, there's a few things that make it quite difficult for companies like PayPal to act. Number one is that the far right communicates in dog whistles. Dog whistles are coded language, which kind of only insiders understand. I'll give you an example from Nemesis, actually. This is not on PayPal, but it's a good example because it shows how insidious the communication is. A few weeks ago on social media, Nemesis posted like an illustration that said something like, uh, pure blood white women's movement or something, or like the pure blood movement. And then they wrote in the caption that it was meant as an homage to the women who resisted the Nazis and ironically used the phrase pure blood in the Nazi time. This is an example of a dog whistle that the far right often uses. So, and this extends to when they use platforms like PayPal. Um, for PayPal's algorithms, but also for their content moderators who do not necessarily always intimately know the language used by different far right groups, It's quite difficult to spot when something is pointing to that. The other thing that could compound the issue is a culture that sometimes prioritizes profit over enforcing its acceptable use policy. I spoke to 3 ex-employees who all alleged that they were encouraged to find ways to accept extremist sellers versus saying no to them outright. Now, this wouldn't mean 100% accept them. Maybe it would mean, letting them have an account with limitations. But the attitude from the company that they described to me is attitude of let's make the sale versus let's not make the sale, even if these smaller merchants are doing something bad.
So you're saying that they kind of have an incentive to not really enforce their own policy.
According to the 3 ex-employees I spoke with, there is an incentive to not enforce the policy completely. Now, I cannot speak for the other parts of the company and perhaps other people who have different experiences, but this was a focus of my investigation, is to try to figure out if the ex-employees that I am able to talk to are all saying the same thing, which they were. Also, why wouldn't PayPal turn a blind eye? PayPal is one of the biggest payment platforms in the world. It is an American company. Its founders are famously sympathetic to the right wing, let's say. Also, right now, the administration in the US is a far right administration. So, I mean, it would be a bad business decision for PayPal to actually take a stand against these things.
And you were also just talking about this idea of dog whistling. And then I'm wondering, are we even always talking about humans that should spot these things? Or is it also a lot of like automated monitoring that takes place?
Indeed. So PayPal relies on algorithms to kind of detect that its merchants are doing the right thing in a certain sense. However, my sources tell me that these algorithms are built to catch fraud. They're not built to scan for extremism. Um, my perception from reporting is that there's an idea that the algorithms will catch extremism or will catch things that are, completely illegal or so on and so forth. But in practice, it does not seem like that is being very effectively done. In fact, a person who I spoke to who used to work at PayPal said that he wouldn't trust the algorithm to catch these kind of extremist sellers. So relying on the algorithm seems to be an issue, which is impeding PayPal's ability to catch these extremists.
What did PayPal say to your article?
PayPal said that they took what I said quite seriously. I sent them a list of the groups that I had found, and they said they would investigate them. PayPal also said that they work with law enforcement a lot to keep illegal activity off its platforms. Um, they said that they work with anti-trafficking initiatives, all these kind of things. And they sent me a lot in the writer reply, and I was actually very relieved. I didn't think they would reply, but they did. Problem is, though, that they didn't really answer a lot of my questions. For instance, I specifically I sent them the items from Collective Nemesis's web shop, and I specifically asked them, like, how does this, fit into your acceptable use policy? I told them that Collective Nemesis has documented ties to neo-Nazis. I asked them what they think about having a merchant like this. I asked them if further automation might make this problem worse and if they have checks and balances. They didn't reply to any of those things, which is probably not surprising, but it's also not unique to PayPal. Many other payment platforms use algorithms in a similar way, and I think many run into a similar issue.
And at the same time, advocating from sort of a devil's advocate perspective, you could also say, well, isn't this free speech? Shouldn't like anyone be allowed to make these things and sell them through PayPal? How would you look at that argument?
So the free speech argument is a very interesting one and actually a very tricky one to resolve. I don't have a clear answer about the line between free speech and racist, xenophobic, discriminatory items that don't belong in PayPal. But what's more, none of my sources had a clear answer about this either. I mean, I talked to a researcher who has been studying payment platforms for I think around a decade, and we talked a lot about this point, but she didn't come up with a clear answer either, which is also the difficulty in asking for accountability, particularly when we look at the language in PayPal's acceptable use policy. So the language that says the transactions that promote racism, discrimination, blah, 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 the language that says that in the acceptable use policy is so broad that I can read into it that PayPal should be doing more, so can other researchers. But it's also broad enough that PayPal can easily say, well, no, I mean, these items here are not actually racist. These items here are not actually xenophobic. What does it mean to, have transactions that promote these things? We don't know if the transactions promote these things. So, as much as the language is specific, there is a tension between um, inviting free speech into that language and also drawing a line between free speech and discrimination in that language. Another point, I think it's also in terms of culture. A few sources told me that PayPal is an American company, even though it's active in Europe and even though it's active in other places. It is built on American values, where American values around free speech are different than they are in Europe in many cases. There's a stronger commitment to the American idea around free speech. So even though European researchers can say this mug that says foreign racist out is clearly racist, an American PayPal executive might say, well, no, that's free speech.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, because I also noticed that under the Dutch version of the article, there was one in the comments. This reader pointed out that, for example, there's a website in the Netherlands where I think nudes are being spread legally, which is allowed in the Netherlands, but PayPal doesn't allow it because it's not in value with PayPal's own rules. So even though while it's allowed in the Netherlands, PayPal says, no, this is not okay for us. So it's sort of this interesting tension that you also see on the other side.
Absolutely. I think, again, this didn't make it into my article, but it's an important point. PayPal is famously good at keeping sex workers off of its platform. In fact, it's so good at keeping sex workers off of its platform that people who have a history of sex work are kind of automatically flagged sometimes and not allowed to have accounts. Now, when it comes to sex workers, it seems that free speech is thrown much more out the window compared to when we're talking about far-right groups and individuals.
So from what you describe, it overall sounds like what we're really talking about here is also sort of this tension between, like, when is it moderation of activities on its platform, and when is it interpretation of what's happening on the platform?
Correct. The tension is very much that there is an interpretation happening of what's allowed and what's not, and that interpretation is fluid. Um, I think also, in general, talking points that are used by center-right governments today in Europe 10 years ago would have been considered extreme far-right. There's this normalization of more and more extremist rhetoric or viewpoints. I'm quite sure that that normalization also influences how a company like PayPal reacts to these users and merchants and sellers. Um, Maybe 10 years ago, PayPal would have taken a stronger stance against groups like this and prioritized it more because socially that was also the status quo. Today, as we're seeing the far right, their ideology kind of become embraced by more and more aspects of society, PayPal seems to reflect this too in terms of the decision they're making about these kind of sellers on their platform.
And then that interpretation also leads to sort of this inconsistent enforcement policy.
Correct. So historically, PayPal has had like a reactionary position. When it's been made aware of users that break its own policies, it acts. It did this before due to something called reputational risk. Part of the way that PayPal has operated is to try to maintain its reputation. And so to try to get rid of sellers, which can ultimately damage its reputation for valid reasons. Things might look a little bit different today. The Trump administration sent a directive to payment platforms, including PayPal, that essentially said that they can no longer get rid of merchants or prohibit activity on their platform due to reputational risk. The subtext of this, I think, looking at the Trump administration, is maybe a fear of PayPal limiting actors which align with the Trump administration's ideology. The Trump administration has said specifically you cannot act on certain customers anymore due to this reputational risk factor. So the context today for PayPal is different than it was pre-Trump administration.
So from what you've seen in your article, do you also feel like this is sort of this larger issue about how big tech helps to, like, spread this ideology?
Yes, my article or my investigation, although it's specific about far right merch, which tries to sanitize dangerous ideology, in my opinion, dangerous ideology. It's a take into an issue which is rampant basically everywhere, and which all of our societies are now struggling with. Um, it's on Meta, for example. Racist speech is now not moderated as it was before. Um, Misogynist speech, like homophobic speech, all this stuff that is given more of a platform right now on Meta for business decisions and for politically convenient decisions for Meta. There was a BBC investigation that showed that Meta actually allowed discriminatory and violent speech, including far right extremist speech, to stay on the platform because it helped with user engagement and therefore, kept people on the platform, right? So we have a very difficult puzzle in society right now where we're trying to figure out how to essentially rein in big tech and keep it from making polarization and violence worse in society when we actually don't have a lot of policies that are actively in place to force big tech to toe the line. In Europe, we have the Digital Services Act, which is a great first step, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it's actually enacted against big tech platforms because it's still early days. But I wish that we had had this 10 years ago.
In the Digital Services Act, that's like meant to regulate content on big tech platforms, but that's extremely unpopular with American companies and the American government, right?
So unpopular with Americans, and in fact, is often positioned as the EU trying to stop free speech all over the world with its communist Digital Services Act. So yeah, it's a point of tension.
And in doing this whole investigation, was there sort of like one aspect that really surprised you the most?
Yeah, actually, I think what shocked me the most was how much of an open secret it is that PayPal facilitates the far right. Um, my investigation, it focuses on a specific segment of the far right, and there hasn't been that much investigative reporting about the far right on PayPal. However, in my initial days of research, I just started seeing like, oh, what's out there about the far right on PayPal, and there is so much research out there about far right merchants on PayPal going back years. There have been hundreds of accounts found on PayPal which have been considered problematic. So I think I was just surprised by how this has been allowed to be the status quo for a very long time. This has been the status quo even before we had this kind of global shift towards right-wing ideology.
And how has Nemesis reacted to all of this? Did you also speak to them for this story?
Yes. So I sent Nemesis a right of reply where I basically included all the allegations I had made and asked them for their response. And uh, considering that my allegations were you are selling items to sanitize your racist ideology, they didn't react super well. um, they basically denied everything, and then they also said that they quote did not give a fuck about the fact that their merchandise could be seen as sanitizing their ideology. So that was the extent of my communication with them for this story. In terms of their reaction afterwards, I did notice that the the mug with the "Foreign Rapist Out" slogan, and the T-shirt with the anti-woke feminist thing, and I think a few other items have been taken off of their web shop. I mean, I cannot be 100% sure that it's not just because they're sold out, but the timing of it does seem very suspicious.
Since March 2026, PayPal has also had a new CEO. He's called Enrique Lores. What do you expect from this new CEO? Do you think things are going to change? Do you think it's even going to be worse?
Well, I don't know that much about the new CEO, but I do know that he has announced a push towards more AI and more AI development in PayPal. Um, and also has hinted at further staff cuts, similar to the ones that plagued PayPal over the 2020s. I think that these two things sound risky um, because my article identified that staff cuts and relying on algorithms are two factors which explain why the far right keeps on finding its way onto PayPal. I do wonder if PayPal has a plan to make sure that, the more it invests in AI and gets rid of staff with years of experience, the less chances it'll have to have the negative effects from those decisions. I wonder if PayPal has kind of put checks and balances in place to make sure that more automation doesn't mean less moderation.
All right, so on that note, we'll leave it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me, Paulina, and thank you so much for this interesting conversation. And I'll be back soon for another episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Emma.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.